I notice the forest first, the way silence gathers between the trees like something you could hold in your hands. And in that gathering quiet, there's a kind of attention, the sort that pulls you inward, not towards sleep, though that might come, but towards something older, something that has always lived in the space between what we know and what we cannot name. Language. The word itself feels almost too small, like trying to cup water in your palms. It spills through, it reshapes itself, and yet we use it. We have always used it, long before we understood what it was we were doing. Tonight, I find myself thinking about this, about the way sounds become meaning, the way breath becomes words, and words become everything we have ever known. There's a particular quality to the air when you begin to notice these things, when you start paying attention to the architecture of thought itself. And I imagine, just for a moment, what it might have been like tens of thousands of years ago, when the first human voice shaped itself around an idea, around a need to share what was inside, to make the invisible visible. The darkness around me feels generous, patient, and in it I can almost hear echoes, not literal echoes, but something like them, the accumulated weight of every utterance, every whispered secret and shouted declaration, every lullaby and prayer and joke and argument that has ever moved through human lips. Linguistics, the study of this magnificent complexity. This thing we do without thinking, breathing and speaking and meaning all at once. It asks us to slow down, to look closely at what we've been doing all along, to see the patterns we've been weaving since before we knew we were weavers. And there's something deeply calming about this, about recognizing that we are all, every one of us, walking repositories of linguistic knowledge, that our tongues know things our minds have never formally learned, that we navigate grammatical structures more intricate than any cathedral without ever having seen the blueprints. I think about a child, any child, in any time, in any place, listening, absorbing, building an entire system of communication from the sounds that float around them, and how this happens, how it has always happened, without textbooks or instruction manuals, just the patient accumulation of patterns, the slow recognition of how pieces fit together. The study of language, when you really enter into it, becomes a study of everything, because language touches everything. It's there in the way we remember, the way we dream, the way we organize reality into categories and concepts. It's the medium through which we inherit the thoughts of the dead and pass our own thoughts to the unborn. And tonight, in this quiet space, I want to trace some of these threads, to follow the long story of how we came to understand what language is and what it does, and how it works its particular magic. This isn't a history exactly, though history will move through it. And it isn't a lesson, though there are things here worth learning. It's more like a slow walk through a museum at closing time, when the crowds have gone, and you can stand before each display as long as you like, letting your attention settle, letting the details emerge from the dimness. The field of linguistics, as a formal discipline, as a named pursuit, is relatively young, but the questions it asks are ancient. People have always wondered about language, about its origins, about its diversity, about the relationship between words and world, between sound and sense, and there's a particular texture to these questions, a quality of infinite regression, because we use language to study language, We're inside the thing we're trying to see clearly, like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. And yet, we've developed such remarkable ways of looking, such sophisticated instruments of attention. I imagine the earliest grammarians in ancient India, in classical Greece, in medieval Iceland, listening to their own languages with new ears, beginning to catalog, to classify, to notice the rules hiding inside what seemed like chaos, and how that noticing, that careful attention, was itself a kind of meditation, a way of honoring the mystery by mapping its contours. The landscape of language, if we could see it all at once, would stretch beyond any horizon. Thousands of languages, each one a complete universe of expression, each one solving the same fundamental problem, how to move meaning from one mind to another, but solving it in such wildly different ways. And we'll explore some of these these beautiful variations as we move forward. But for now, in this opening moment, I want us to just appreciate the vastness, the improbable richness of human linguistic diversity, because there's something profoundly soothing about knowing that while you and I might share a language, there are people right now in this same moment speaking in ways so different from our own that we couldn't even imagine the sounds without hearing them, using grammars that organize reality according to principles we've never encountered. And yet, all of it, all of these thousands of systems, they all work. They all accomplish the fundamental task of human communication. The night deepens around these thoughts, and I feel ready to begin the journey properly, to step into the long unfolding story of how we came to understand this thing we do, this speaking, this meaning-making, this most human of all human capacities. The story begins, as so many stories do, not with a single moment, but with a slow accumulation of attention, with people noticing, with the gradual recognition that language itself could be examined, could be understood as a system, as something with rules and patterns that existed whether we acknowledged them or not. In ancient India, is more than 2,000 years before the Common Era, there were scholars who listened to Sanskrit with extraordinary precision, who heard not just meaning but structure, not just communication but form, and they began to write down what they heard, to create grammars that cataloged every inflection, every modification, every subtle shift in sound that carried a shift in meaning. Panini, whose name we still speak with reverence, composed what might be the most elegant grammar ever written, sometime around the 4th century before the Common Era, a work called the Ashtadhyayi, which means simply 8 chapters. But within those chapters was contained a system so sophisticated, so economically brilliant, that modern linguists still marvel at its construction. He didn't write in sentences as we might expect, but in sutras, compressed formulas, each one a kind of seed from which understanding could grow. And these sutras described Sanskrit with such precision that if you understood the system, you could generate any grammatically correct Sanskrit utterance and recognize any deviation from correctness. This wasn't just description. It was something deeper. It was the recognition that beneath the surface variety of speech, there existed rules, consistent principles, and that these principles could be made explicit, could be taught, could be preserved. The motivation was partly spiritual, partly practical. The Vedic texts were sacred, and they needed to be transmitted with perfect accuracy. Every sound mattered, every accent and duration and aspiration, because the power of the mantras resided not just in their meaning, but in their exact phonetic form. So the ancient Indian grammarians developed a science of sound, phonetics, before it was called phonetics. They mapped the positions of the tongue, the movements of the lips, the engagement of the vocal cords. They understood voiced and voiceless consonants, aspirated and unaspirated. They knew about places of articulation in the mouth, and they organized this knowledge into systematic classifications. And there's something almost musical about this attention, this loving precision, the way they listened to language as a musician might listen to a composition, hearing not just the notes, but the relationships between notes, the patterns that gave structure to sound. Meanwhile, in another part of the ancient world, Greek philosophers were asking different questions about language, questions about its relationship to reality, about whether words were natural or conventional, whether the connection between a sound and its meaning was arbitrary or somehow essential. Plato, in his dialogue Cratylus, explored this tension, presenting arguments on both sides. One character suggesting that names are natural, that they somehow capture the essence of what they name. Another arguing that names are merely conventional, agreed-upon labels that could just as easily be otherwise. And Plato left the question beautifully unresolved, hanging in the air like an invitation to keep thinking. Aristotle, with his systematic mind, his drive to categorize and classify, began to develop concepts that would shape linguistic thinking for millennia. He identified parts of speech, noun and verb. He thought about tense and case, about the relationship between language and logic, about how statements could be true or false, how premises could lead to conclusions. His work wasn't primarily about language. It was about thought, about reasoning, about the structure of knowledge. But language was the medium through which thought moved. And so understanding language became necessary for understanding thought itself. The Greeks gave us the word grammar from grammatic techne, the art of letters, and they began to codify the rules of Greek to describe its structure, though their descriptions were often tangled up with prescriptions, with ideas about how language should be rather than simply how it was. Centuries passed, and the Roman grammarians built on Greek foundations, Donatus and Priscian, names that echo through the history of education, wrote Latin grammars that would be copied and studied for more than 1,000 years, their work becoming the template through which medieval Europe understood language itself. But these ancient grammarians, sophisticated as they were primarily concerned with particular languages, with Sanskrit or Greek or Latin. They didn't yet have the comparative perspective, the recognition that studying many languages together might reveal something about language in general, about the human capacity for speech itself. That comparative vision, that broader perspective, would take time to develop, would require contact between cultures, the collision and mixing of linguistic communities, the slow accumulation of knowledge about just how differently human languages could be structured. In medieval Iceland, the first grammatical treatise, written by an unknown author in the 12th century, showed remarkable phonological insight. The author had studied Latin grammar, but recognized that Icelandic had sounds that Latin didn't, and rather than forcing Icelandic into Latin categories, he developed new symbols, new ways of representing the distinctive sounds of his own language. This was a kind of linguistic independence, a recognition that each language had its own integrity, its own system, and that understanding required flexibility, required meeting the language on its own terms, rather than imposing foreign categories. The medieval period saw the rise of speculative grammarians, the modistes, who believed that grammar reflected the structure of reality, that there was a universal grammar underlying all languages, a common logical framework. They were wrong in many of their specifics, but the impulse toward universals, toward finding what all languages share, that impulse would return again and again in linguistic thought. And then, gradually, Europe began to wake to the diversity of world languages. Explorers and missionaries encountered languages utterly unlike Latin or Greek, languages that seemed to organize reality differently, that had grammatical categories European languages lacked, that lacked categories European languages took for granted. The age of exploration, for all its violence and exploitation, its colonial horror, did bring languages into contact, did force European scholars to confront linguistic structures they had never imagined, Nahuatl and Quechua, Tamil and Tagalog, languages that couldn't be understood through Greco-Roman grammatical frameworks, that demanded new approaches, new tools of description. Missionaries learning indigenous languages to convert souls often became, almost inadvertently, documenters of linguistic diversity. They wrote grammars and dictionaries. They tried to map these strange new sound systems onto familiar alphabets. And in doing so, they preserved records of languages that would later vanish or transform beyond recognition. But still, the study of language remained fragmented, scattered across different traditions, different purposes. There wasn't yet a unified field, a discipline that studied language for its own sake, that asked systematic questions about how language worked, how it changed, how it was acquired, how it related to mind and culture and society. The 18th century brought new currents of thought, the Enlightenment's faith in reason, in systematic inquiry, in the possibility of understanding nature through observation and classification, and language as a natural phenomenon, as a human universal, began to attract this systematic attention. Scholars began to notice striking similarities between languages separated by vast distances, between Sanskrit and Latin and Greek, between Persian and the Germanic languages, patterns of correspondence that seemed too regular to be accidental, that suggested some kind of historical connection, some common ancestry. Sir William Jones, a British judge working in India in the late 1700s, made an observation that would transform linguistic study. He noticed that Sanskrit bore a striking resemblance to Greek and Latin, not just in vocabulary, but in grammatical structure, in the very architecture of the language. And he suggested in a lecture delivered in 1786 that these languages must have sprung from a common source, perhaps no longer existing. This was the birth, or perhaps the articulation, of comparative linguistics, the recognition that languages were related, that they formed families, that they evolved and changed over time according to regular principles, and that by comparing languages carefully, by identifying systematic correspondences, scholars could reconstruct linguistic prehistory, could trace the branching paths by which modern languages descended from ancient ancestors. The early 1800s saw an explosion of comparative work. Scholars like Rasmus Rask and Franz Bopp and Jacob Grimm, the same Grimm who would later collect fairy tales, they began to work out the regular sound correspondences between related languages to show that when Latin had a PA sound, Germanic languages often had an F, that these weren't random variations, but systematic shifts, sound laws that operated with almost mathematical regularity. Jacob Grimm formulated what came to be known as Grimm's Law, describing a pattern of consonant shifts that had occurred in the Germanic languages, showing how Proto-Indo-European stops had systematically shifted, how you could predict what sound would appear in one language based on what appeared in another. And this regularity, this law-like behavior suggested that language change wasn't chaotic, wasn't arbitrary, but followed principles that could be discovered and described. The neo-grammarians, Die Junggrammatiker, a group of German scholars in the late 1800s, pushed this insight to its extreme. They insisted that sound laws admitted no exceptions, that if a sound change occurred, it occurred everywhere in the language, in every word that met the right conditions, and that apparent exceptions must be explained by other factors, by analogy or borrowing or some other systematic process. This was a radical position, one that treated linguistic change as a natural science, subject to laws as regular as those governing physics or chemistry. And while the strictest version of this view would later be modified, softened, the fundamental insight remained that language change was systematic, that it could be studied scientifically, that history left traceable patterns in the structure of language, and this systematic approach, this scientific rigor, opened doors that had been closed for centuries. Suddenly, language wasn't just a tool for communication or a repository of culture or a marker of identity. It was also a natural phenomenon, something that could be studied with the same methods used to study geology or biology, something with its own patterns and principles and history. The reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European, the hypothetical ancestor of Sanskrit and Greek and Latin and Persian and Celtic and Germanic and Slavic and dozens of other language families, became a great collaborative project of 19th century scholarship. Scholars working backwards from known languages, comparing vocabularies, identifying sound correspondences, slowly piecing together a language that had never been written down, that had vanished millennia before writing reached the people who spoke it. They reconstructed not just sounds but words, not just words but meanings. They could say with reasonable confidence that the speakers of Proto-Indo-European had a word for father, for mother, for brother and sister and daughter and son. They had words for animals, for horse and cow and sheep and wolf. They had words for natural phenomena, for snow and star and moon and sun. And from these reconstructed vocabularies, scholars tried to imagine where these people had lived, what their culture had been like, what animals and plants and landscapes they had known. This was linguistic paleontology, recovering vanished worlds from the traces left in living speech, and it carried a certain poetry, a certain romance, the idea that every word we speak connects us to speakers long dead, that language is a kind of time machine, carrying ancient patterns forward into the present. But even as comparative linguistics flourished, as Indo-European studies dominated the field, There were scholars asking different questions, questions not about historical relationships, but about synchronic structure, about how languages worked as systems at a given moment in time, regardless of their history or origins. Ferdinand de Saussure, a Swiss linguist working at the turn of the 20th century, would fundamentally reorient the field, though ironically his most influential work wasn't published until after his death, compiled from students' lecture notes, assembled into a book called The Course in General Linguistics. Saussure made a crucial distinction between langue and parole, between language as an abstract system, the set of rules and patterns shared by a community, and language as actual speech, the concrete utterances produced by individuals. And he argued that linguistics should focus primarily on langue, on the system, because that's what speakers actually know. That's what makes communication possible. He also distinguished between synchronic and diachronic study, between analyzing language at a single point in time and tracing its historical development. And while both were valuable, he suggested that synchronic analysis was logically prior. You needed to understand how a language system worked before you could meaningfully study how it changed. Perhaps most importantly, Saussure articulated the principle that the linguistic sign, the connection between sound and meaning, between what he called the signifier and the signified, was fundamentally arbitrary. There's no natural reason why the sound tree should mean tree, or why arbre should mean the same thing in French, or Baum in German. The connection is conventional, established by social agreement, maintained by community practice. This arbitrariness, this conventionality, was crucial because it meant that language was a self-contained system, a structure of relationships, where each element derived its value not from any external reference, but from its position within the system, from its differences from other elements. A word meant what it meant, not because of any inherent connection between sound and sense, but because it wasn't other words, because it occupied a particular position in a network of contrasts and oppositions. Big means what it means partly because it isn't small, hot, because it isn't cold. Language was a system of differences, of values created through relationship and opposition. This structuralist insight, this way of thinking about language as system rather than substance, would ripple out far beyond linguistics. It would influence anthropology and literary criticism, psychology and philosophy. It would become one of the defining intellectual movements of the 20th century. But at its heart, it was an insight about language, about how meaning emerges from structure, from pattern, from the elegant architecture of differences. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American linguists were developing their own approaches, shaped by their own intellectual contexts and practical challenges. Franz Boas, an anthropologist working with indigenous languages of North America, emphasized the need to describe each language on its own terms, to resist the temptation to impose familiar categories from European languages onto radically different systems. He and his students, Edward Sapir and Leonard Bloomfield and others, documented languages that were vanishing, that were threatened by colonization and forced assimilation, and in documenting them, they encountered grammatical structures that challenged every assumption about what language could be. Languages with noun classes based on shape or animacy rather than gender. Languages where the verb carried information about the shape or consistency of its object. Languages with evidential markers that specified how the speaker knew what they were claiming, whether through direct perception or inference or hearsay. Grammatical distinctions that English simply didn't make, that English speakers didn't even think to make. Sapir, with his poet's sensibility, his feeling for the aesthetic dimensions of language, wrote about linguistic relativity, about the possibility that the language you speak shapes how you think, how you perceive, how you carve up the continuous flow of experience into discrete categories. His student Benjamin Lee Whorf would develop this idea further, though often in ways Sapir himself might not have endorsed. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, as it came to be known, suggested in its strongest form that language determines thought, that speakers of different languages literally inhabit different cognitive worlds. And while this strong version has been largely rejected, there's still fascinating research on weaker forms, on how language might influence rather than determine, might make certain thoughts easier or harder, might direct attention in particular ways. Bloomfield, taking a very different approach, tried to make linguistics rigorously scientific, to base it on observable behavior rather than introspection or intuition. His approach, called structural linguistics, or sometimes American descriptivism, focused on distribution, on what elements could appear where, on the patterns of combination that defined grammatical structure. He wanted linguistics to be objective, empirical, free from mentalism, from appeals to meaning or intention or mental states. And while this behaviorist framework would eventually be challenged, the descriptive techniques Bloomfield developed, the careful attention to phonological and morphological patterns, the systematic methods for analyzing linguistic structure, these became fundamental tools of the field. The mid-20th century brought another revolution, another fundamental reorientation of how linguists thought about their subject. And this revolution came from an unexpected source, a young scholar at MIT trained in mathematics and logic, whose work would transform not just linguistics but cognitive science more broadly. Noam Chomsky, in a review published in 1959, systematically dismantled the behaviorist approach to language, arguing that language acquisition couldn't be explained by stimulus and response, by reinforcement and conditioning, because children produced sentences they'd never heard, because they extracted rules from limited input, because the linguistic knowledge they developed was far richer than the evidence available to them. This was the poverty of the stimulus argument, the observation that what children learn about language vastly exceeds what they could logically derive from the examples they hear. And Chomsky's solution was to propose that humans are born with an innate language faculty, a universal grammar, a set of principles and parameters that constrain and guide language acquisition. Language, in this view, wasn't learned the way you might learn to ride a bicycle or memorize multiplication tables. It was grown, developed, triggered by exposure to a particular linguistic environment. Children didn't need to be taught grammar. They already knew it. Deep down, they just needed to figure out which specific language they were hearing, which parameter settings applied to their particular linguistic community. This nativist position, this emphasis on innate biological endowment, sparked fierce debates that continue to this day, but it also opened up new research programs, new questions about what exactly was innate, about how universal grammar might be instantiated in the brain, about the relationship between language and other cognitive capacities. Chomsky's technical contributions were equally revolutionary. He developed formal theories of syntax, transformational grammar, phrase structure rules, the distinction between deep structure and surface structure, ways of representing the hierarchical organization of sentences, the relationships between elements that might be far apart on the surface, but closely connected in underlying structure. He showed that you could have sentences with the same surface form, but different underlying structures, like John is eager to please and John is easy to please, where John is the one doing the pleasing in the first, but receiving it in the second. And he showed that understanding these sentences required access to abstract structural relationships that went beyond the linear sequence of words. The Chomskyan revolution, as it's often called, made linguistics more formal, more mathematical, more focused on competence rather than performance, on the abstract knowledge that underlies linguistic ability rather than the messy details of actual language use. And while this approach had its critics, while many felt it neglected important aspects of language, its social dimensions, its variation, its use in real communicative contexts, it undeniably energized the field, attracted brilliant minds from mathematics and philosophy and computer science, turned linguistics into a hub of cognitive science. The late 20th century saw linguistics fragment into subfields, into specializations. Phonology studying sound systems, morphology studying word structure, syntax studying sentence structure, semantics studying meaning, pragmatics studying language use in context, sociolinguistics studying variation and change, psycholinguistics studying acquisition and processing, neurolinguistics studying the brain bases of language, computational linguistics developing algorithms and models. Each subfield developed its own methods, its own theoretical frameworks, its own debates and controversies. But they all shared a common subject, this extraordinary human capacity, this ability to map sounds to meanings, to combine elements in endlessly creative ways, to communicate thoughts and feelings and ideas with remarkable precision and flexibility. And researchers discovered, again and again, that language was more complex than anyone had imagined, that even the simplest utterance involved intricate coordination of perceptual and motor and cognitive systems, that children acquiring language were solving computational problems of staggering difficulty, that the human brain had specialized regions and circuits dedicated to linguistic processing, that damage to specific areas could produce specific linguistic deficits, aphasia that affected grammar but spared vocabulary, or vocabulary but spared grammar. The study of signed languages, languages that use gesture rather than sound, revealed that the human language capacity wasn't tied to any particular modality, that deaf communities developed fully complex languages with all the grammatical sophistication of spoken languages, organized in space rather than time, and that children exposed to signed languages acquired them in the same stages with the same ease as hearing children acquired spoken languages. This expanded the very definition of language, showed that what mattered wasn't sound, wasn't the vocal tract, but rather the abstract principles of combination and structure, the ability to map form to meaning, to create unlimited expressions from limited means. The closing decades of the 20th century brought an increasing awareness of linguistic diversity as both a scientific treasure and a fragile resource. Researchers began to document just how many languages existed in the world, how they were distributed, how many speakers each had, and the numbers were staggering, somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 languages, spoken by 7 billion people, an almost unimaginable variety of ways that human communities had solved the problem of communication. But alongside this documentation came a darker realization that languages were disappearing at an alarming rate, that globalization and urbanization and political pressure were leading speakers to abandon their ancestral languages, to shift to dominant regional or national languages, and that at current rates, half of the world's languages might vanish by the end of the 21st century, taking with them unique ways of organizing experience, unique stores of cultural knowledge, unique solutions to the puzzle of how to speak. This sparked urgent efforts at language documentation. Linguists working with communities to record endangered languages, to create grammars and dictionaries, to develop writing systems where none existed, to preserve at least some record of languages that might soon have no living speakers. And this work brought linguists into closer contact with communities, raised questions about who owns language, who has the right to study it, how linguistic research could serve rather than exploit the people whose languages were being documented. The field began to reckon with its colonial past, with the ways that language study had sometimes been complicit in cultural destruction, with how missionaries and administrators had used linguistic knowledge to facilitate control and conversion, and a new ethic emerged, one that emphasized collaboration, that respected community ownership of linguistic knowledge, that saw language documentation not as extraction, but as partnership. At the same time, technology was transforming what was possible in linguistic research. Computers allowed for the analysis of a massive corpora, collections of texts or transcripts, revealing patterns that would have been invisible to researchers working with small samples, showing how frequently particular words or constructions appeared, in what contexts, with what collocations and associations, speech recognition and synthesis, machine translation, natural language processing. These computational applications both drew on and contributed to theoretical linguistics. They required explicit formal models, precise specifications of grammatical rules, and they revealed the extraordinary difficulty of tasks that humans performed effortlessly: the contextual knowledge, the pragmatic inference, the handling of ambiguity that underlies even simple conversation, the dream of machine translation, dating back to the early days of computing, had proven far more difficult than anyone expected. Early systems produced famously garbled translations. And it became clear that translating between languages required not just matching words, but understanding meaning. Not just applying rules, but grasping context. Not just processing syntax, but interpreting intention. But gradually, with the development of statistical approaches and later neural networks and deep learning, machine translation improved. Systems that learned the patterns from vast amounts of translated text, that didn't rely on hand-coded rules but discovered regularities through exposure to examples. And while these systems still made errors, still missed nuances, still struggled with idioms and cultural references, they demonstrated that some aspects of linguistic knowledge could be extracted from data, could emerge from pattern recognition rather than explicit instruction. Neuroscience contributed new tools and new perspectives. Brain imaging technologies, fMRI and PET scans, and EEG, allowing researchers to observe the living brain as it processed language, to identify regions that activated during speech production or comprehension, to track the millisecond by millisecond unfolding of linguistic processing. Researchers found that language wasn't localized to a single area, but distributed across networks. That Broca's area and Wernicke's area, the classical language regions identified from 19th century lesion studies, were part of larger circuits. That processing grammar and processing meaning recruited overlapping but distinguishable neural systems. That the brain's response to linguistic violations, to sentences that broke grammatical rules, showed distinctive electrical signatures. The study of bilingualism revealed remarkable plasticity, showed that the brain could maintain multiple language systems, could switch between them flexibly, that learning a second language changed neural structure, and that these changes depended on age of acquisition, on proficiency, on how the languages were used, challenging earlier assumptions about critical periods and native-like attainment. Evolutionary linguistics emerged as a vibrant field, asking how language evolved, what precursors existed in other species, what genetic changes might have enabled human linguistic capacity. And while many questions remained deeply controversial, while the evidence was necessarily fragmentary, researchers made progress on understanding the evolutionary context, the selective pressures, the cognitive prerequisites that had to be in place before language could emerge. Studies of animal communication, of birdsong and whale song, of primate calls and bee dances revealed sophisticated systems, but none with the full combinatorial power of human language, none with the same recursive structure, the ability to embed phrases within phrases, to generate unlimited novel expressions from finite means. And this suggested that while many animals communicated, while many had signals and calls and displays, language as humans practiced it was genuinely unique, the product of specific evolutionary innovations. The FOXP2 gene, discovered through the study of a family with severe speech and language difficulties, provided the first concrete link between genetics and language. Mutations in this gene disrupted the ability to coordinate the fine motor movements required for speech, and comparative studies showed that the human version of FOXP2 differed from that in other primates, that these differences had arisen relatively recently in evolutionary time, though the gene itself was ancient, involved in many aspects of development, not a language gene in any simple sense, but one piece of the complex genetic architecture underlying linguistic ability. Fieldwork continued. Linguists traveling to remote regions, documenting languages spoken by small communities, and these descriptions revealed again and again how inadequate our theoretical frameworks were, how they'd been shaped by the familiar languages of Europe and Asia, how they struggled to account for the full range of human linguistic diversity. Languages with objects that preceded verbs, with verbs that came at the very end of sentences, languages with no clear distinction between nouns and verbs, languages with elaborate systems of classifiers, of evidentials, of tense and aspect markings that tracked information European languages ignored, languages that incorporated gestures as grammatical elements, that used iconicity direct resemblance between form and meaning in ways that challenge Saussure's principle of arbitrariness, researchers working on these languages developed new theoretical frameworks, new ways of thinking about universals and variation, some arguing that diversity was so profound that the search for universal grammar was misguided, that languages were fundamentally different systems, shaped by history and culture and communicative needs. Others arguing that beneath surface diversity there were indeed deep commonalities, but that these commonalities were more abstract, more flexible than earlier theories had proposed. The field fractured into schools, into competing approaches: Chomskyan generative grammar, cognitive linguistics, construction grammar, functional typology, each with its own assumptions, its own methodologies, its own journals and conferences and training programs. And while this fragmentation sometimes felt divisive, it also reflected vitality, the existence of multiple productive research programs, multiple ways of asking questions about language, and through all these developments, all these theoretical debates and technical advances, there remained something fundamentally mysterious about language, something that resisted complete explanation. The fact that every neurologically typical child exposed to language acquired it, that they did so rapidly, effortlessly, without formal instruction, that they became fluent speakers of systems of immense complexity, that they could produce and comprehend sentences they'd never encountered before, that they could use language not just to communicate, but to think, to plan, to remember, to imagine. Researchers studied language acquisition in increasingly fine detail, tracking children's early vocalizations, their first words, their explosion into multi-word utterances, their mastery of grammatical morphemes, their growing ability to handle complex syntax, and they found remarkable regularities, stages that children passed through, errors that were systematic rather than random, over-regularizations where children applied rules too broadly, saying "goed" instead of "went," revealing that they were extracting patterns, forming hypotheses, actively constructing grammar rather than passively absorbing it. But they also found variation, individual differences in pace and style, in whether children began with hollow phrases, single words standing for whole meanings, or with telegraphic multi-word combinations, differences that correlated with temperament, with environment, with the linguistic input children received, showing that while the broad trajectory was universal, the details were shaped by individual and cultural factors. The study of language disorders, of specific language impairment, of dyslexia, of autism spectrum conditions and their variable impact on linguistic development, revealed dissociations, cases where linguistic abilities were impaired while other cognitive capacities were intact, or where language developed normally despite cognitive impairments in other domains. And these dissociations supported the idea that language was in some sense modular, a distinct system with its own neural basis and developmental trajectory. Sociolinguistics flourished, documenting the social stratification of linguistic variation, how pronunciation and grammar and vocabulary varied by class, by region, by ethnicity, by gender, by age, showing that language wasn't uniform even within a single community, that speakers commanded multiple varieties, that they shifted between them depending on context, on audience, on the identity they wanted to project. William Labov's work on sound change and progress tracking how vowel pronunciations were shifting in real time in American cities, demonstrated that language change was observable, measurable, that it followed social patterns, spreading through networks, led by particular demographic groups, and that speakers weren't consciously aware of most of these changes. They were happening below the level of explicit attention, driven by social dynamics rather than deliberate choice. The recognition that all languages and dialects were equally valid as linguistic systems, that non-standard varieties weren't corrupted or degraded forms, but legitimate varieties with their own rules and structures, helped challenge linguistic prejudice, the way that dialects were used to discriminate, to deny opportunities, to mark speakers as uneducated or unintelligent. Though this recognition in academic linguistics hasn't always translated to broader social acceptance. And as the 21st century began, as new technologies emerged, social media and messaging apps and voice assistants, language adapted, new forms of written communication developed, blending features of speech and writing, creating novel conventions, acronyms and emoji and reaction GIFs, ways of conveying tone and emotion in text. And linguists studied these innovations, these rapid changes, seeing in them the same creative impulses, the same drive to communicate effectively that had always characterized human language use. The field today is vast, multifaceted, drawing on insights from psychology and neuroscience, from anthropology and computer science, from philosophy and education, asking questions at every level of organization, from the physics of speech sounds to the social dynamics of language communities, from the neural basis of grammar to the cultural construction of meaning. And yet, for all we've learned, for all the sophisticated theories and detailed descriptions, for all the brain scans and corpus analyses and computational models, language retains its essential mystery, its quality of being both utterly familiar and deeply strange, something we do without thinking but cannot fully explain, something that feels natural, effortless, but involves computational processes of staggering complexity. Perhaps this is part of what draws people to the study of language, the way it sits at the intersection of so many domains, neither purely biological nor purely cultural, neither completely universal nor entirely variable, a human capacity that is both ordinary, something every community possesses, and extraordinary, something that sets us apart from every other species, that makes possible everything we think of as distinctively human, art and science and history and philosophy, all of it mediated through language, all of it dependent on our ability to mean, to share, to speak. The thing about language, when you really sit with it, when you let yourself feel the strangeness of what we're doing right now, this moment, where marks on a screen or sounds in the air carry thought from one consciousness to another, is that it's almost impossible to believe, and yet we do it constantly, continuously, without marveling, without pausing to appreciate the improbability of it all. Every word is a miracle of shared convention, of collective agreement, thousands or millions of speakers somehow coordinating, maintaining a stable enough system that we can understand each other, but flexible enough that the system can change, can adapt, can incorporate new meanings, new forms, new ways of expressing what needs to be expressed. And beneath the words, there are the sounds, the phonemes, the minimal units that distinguish meaning. And what counts as a phoneme in one language might be a mere variation in another, might not be heard as meaningful. Speakers of Japanese struggling to hear the difference between R and L. Speakers of English unable to distinguish the tones that carry meaning in Mandarin or Thai or Yoruba. Our perceptual systems tuned by early exposure, shaped by the particular language we encountered as infants. This raises profound questions about perception itself, about whether we hear what's there or what we expect, whether the categories we've learned impose themselves on experience, create boundaries where the physical signal is continuous. And research suggests both that categorical perception is real, that we do hear phonemes as distinct, but that the categories themselves are learned, constructed through exposure, through the statistical regularities of the language around us. Consider tone languages where the same sequence of consonants and vowels can mean entirely different things depending on whether the pitch rises or falls, or remains level, or dips and rises. And speakers of these languages hear tone as naturally as English speakers hear the difference between bit and bat. It's part of the word, inseparable from its identity. Yet speakers of non-tonal languages often struggle to perceive these distinctions, to reproduce them, to remember them, or consider grammatical gender, how German assigns der Mond, the moon, to masculine gender, while die Sonne, the sun, is feminine. But Spanish does the opposite, el sol, la luna, and French agrees with Spanish, le soleil, la lune, and none of these assignments reflect anything about the objects themselves. They're arbitrary, conventional, yet native speakers feel them as natural, as somehow right. Studies have shown that grammatical gender can influence thought in subtle ways. German speakers more likely to describe bridges as beautiful or elegant, using adjectives associated with femininity, because Brücke is feminine, while Spanish speakers might use adjectives associated with masculinity, because puente is masculine, the grammatical category bleeding into conceptual association, into aesthetics judgment. And this is just one example, one small way that linguistic structure might shape cognition. There are thousands of such potential influences, thousands of ways that the particular language we speak might guide our attention, might make certain distinctions easy and others difficult, might provide ready-made categories for some experiences while leaving others unnamed. The Piraha language of the Amazon, described by linguist Daniel Everett, reportedly has no number words beyond 1 and 2, no way to talk about specific quantities. And Piraha speakers perform differently on certain numerical tasks than speakers of languages with elaborate number systems, though debate continues about how to interpret these differences, about whether they reflect linguistic constraint or cultural emphasis, about whether language determines thought or merely facilitates it. Color terms vary dramatically across languages, some languages having dozens of basic color words, others having only 2 or 3, and while there seem to be universal tendencies, certain colors like red and blue emerging as basic terms across many languages, the boundaries between colors, where blue becomes green or green becomes yellow, these vary, and speakers of different languages show subtle differences in color perception, in how quickly they can categorize borderline shades, suggesting that language doesn't determine what we can see, but influences how readily we see it. The question of linguistic relativity, of how language shapes thought, remains one of the most fascinating and contentious in all of linguistics because it touches on fundamental issues of human nature, on whether we all share a common cognitive foundation or whether our minds are sculpted by the particular languages we speak, whether translation is possible because thoughts are universal, or whether something is always lost, always untranslatable, because concepts are language specific. And the answer seems to be, as with so many things, somewhere in between, that there are universal aspects of cognition, constraints imposed by our shared biology, by the structure of perception, by basic needs and experiences that all humans share, but that within these constraints, language provides frameworks, not templates, habitual ways of thinking that differ across communities, that shape but don't determine, that influence but don't imprison. Every language is both a window and a lens, showing us the world, but also coloring how we see it, offering certain perspectives while making others harder to access. And learning a new language isn't just acquiring new words for old concepts, but sometimes acquiring new concepts, new ways of cutting up reality, new dimensions of experience that your first language didn't name. The Japanese concept of ma, the meaningful interval, the space between things, or the Danish hygge, that sense of cozy contentment, or the Portuguese saudade, a melancholic longing for something absent. These aren't just untranslatable words. They are culturally specific ways of attending to experience, of marking certain feelings or situations as meaningful, as worthy of linguistic encoding. And when you learn these words, when you begin to use them, you don't just add to your vocabulary, you add to your emotional repertoire. You begin to notice the thing the word names, to feel it as a distinct experience rather than just a vague, unnamed sensation, language teaching you not just how to speak, but how to feel, how to perceive, how to be in the world. This is perhaps the deepest gift of linguistic diversity, not just that it provides multiple ways to say the same thing, but that it reveals multiple ways to experience reality, multiple valid perspectives on what matters, on what's worth distinguishing, on how to organize the blooming, buzzing confusion of existence into meaningful categories. And as languages disappear, as communities shift to dominant languages under economic and political pressure, we lose more than words. We lose these perspectives, these ways of being human, these experiments in meaning that evolved over thousands of years, shaped by particular landscapes and histories and needs. The night around these thoughts grows deeper, quieter, and I find myself thinking about the first utterances, the first moments when human vocal cords shaped themselves around intention, when sound became more than expression, became symbol, became reference, became the foundation of everything that would follow. We'll never know exactly how it happened, that transition from animal communication to human language, but we can imagine the slow accumulation of innovations, the first use of a consistent sound to mean a specific thing, the first combination of sounds to create new meaning, the first grammatical patterns emerging from repeated use, the way complexity built on complexity, each generation adding to what they inherited, until language became this magnificent edifice we now inhabit. And every child recapitulates this journey in compressed form, moving from cries and coos to babbling, from babbling to first words, from first words to explosions of meaning, building in months and years what took the species millennia, guided by innate capacities, yes, but also by the patient scaffolding of caregivers, by the linguistic community welcoming them into shared understanding. There's something almost sacred about this transmission, this passing of language from generation to generation. Each child a new beginning, a fresh instantiation of the human capacity for meaning, and each language community a living tradition, maintaining and transforming and handing forward this precious inheritance. The world has gone very quiet now, or perhaps I've just stopped hearing anything but the sound of words forming, of meanings emerging, of this strange loop where language thinks about language, where the tool examines itself, where we use the very capacity we're trying to understand to try to understand it. And maybe that's fitting. Maybe that's the only way it could be, because language isn't something we have like a possession, like a tool we pick up and put down. It's something we are. It's woven into the fabric of human consciousness, into how we remember and plan and dream, into the very structure of thought itself. As I let these reflections settle, as the need for words begins to fade, I'm left with a sense of gratitude for this capacity we share, for the millions of years of evolution that made it possible, for the thousands of years of cultural development that shaped it, for the communities that maintain it, for the individuals who study it, trying to understand this most human of human gifts. Language asks nothing of us except that we use it, that we speak and listen, that we read and write, that we pass it on, and in return, it gives us everything, gives us the ability to share our inner lives, to build on the knowledge of the past, to imagine futures that don't yet exist, to create art and science and philosophy and jokes and stories and all the endless variety of human expression. The silence that surrounds these final words feels different now, not empty but full of all the possible utterances, all the things that could be said, all the languages that could say them, a silence pregnant with meaning, with the potential for speech, for connection, for understanding. And perhaps this is where we should rest, in this quiet appreciation, this recognition of language as both ordinary miracle and miraculous ordinance, something so familiar we forget to notice it, something so extraordinary it defies complete explanation, something we do, something we are, something that makes us human. The night holds this knowledge gently, the way it holds all knowledge, without grasping, without demanding, just present, just there, like language itself, like the capacity for meaning, like the long history of humans trying to understand their own voices, their own words, their own endless creative impulse to speak, to share, to mean. And in the growing stillness, in the space between thoughts, in the quiet that needs no words, there's just this, the simple fact of language, existing, persisting, connecting us across time and space, linking mind to mind, building bridges of understanding, constructing the shared world we all inhabit. The words fade now, not into nothing, but into everything, into the vast ocean of language that surrounds us, that we swim through, that we breathe, that carries us, generation after generation, forward into whatever comes next, whatever new forms language will take, whatever new meanings humans will create, whatever new ways we'll find to say what needs saying, to share what needs sharing, to be together in understanding